They looked like the happiest family on TV, but off-camera, cracks ran deep. A teen star haunted by abuse, an actor booted for personality conflicts, an unrequited crush turned icy silence, and a fan tragedy that left a mark forever. Stick around. What happened behind the cameras will leave you stunned. The opening chords of "Come On, Get Happy" promised sunshine, laughter, and a family bound by love. But behind the cameras, the Partridge clan was anything but harmonious. The irony is almost painful. The show that symbolized unity was, in reality, the backdrop for deep divisions, hidden grudges, and personal demons that no laugh track could drown out. From the moment filming began in 1970, the tension was quietly brewing. David Cassidy, the breakout teen idol, already resented being polished into the squeaky-clean Keith Partridge. He wanted to be taken seriously as a rock star, not just another heartthrob plastered on bedroom walls. Shirley Jones, his real-life stepmother who played the family matriarch, worried that David was spiraling under the weight of fame. Meanwhile, Susan Day, who played the wholesome Laurie Partridge, hid a crush on David that would one day explode into heartbreak and icy silence. The smiles looked perfect on camera, but resentment was stitched into every seam of the show. And then there was Danny Bonaduce. Only 11 when the series started, Danny quickly became the wisecracking redhead fans adored. But what audiences didn't see was the brutal chaos of his real life. Off-set, Danny's father was physically abusive, and the boys' desperate need for escape made the set feel like both sanctuary and prison. It wasn't unusual for co-star Dave Madden, the band manager Reuben Kincaid, to step in as a surrogate protector, even giving Danny a place to sleep when things at home got unbearable. Behind every witty punchline on screen was a kid hiding bruises, both physical and emotional. The cracks grew wider with each season. Castmates whispered about conflicts, cold shoulders, and unseen battles. Fans tuned in to watch a perfect family that never truly existed. While behind the camera, alliances formed and feuds quietly simmered. Everyone smiled for the audience, but the cost of that facade would haunt them for years. But if the show seemed shaky from the start, the real fractures became undeniable when one cast member suddenly disappeared without warning. And the explanation was more shocking than anyone expected. On television, Danny Bonaduce was the sharp-tongued, quick-witted kid who always had a punchline ready. Off-camera, though, he was living a life that no child should ever endure. His father, Joseph Bonaduce, was a writer with a violent temper, and Danny often bore the brunt of his rage. The stories Danny later shared about those years were chilling: beatings, verbal tirades, and a home filled with fear instead of warmth. The contrast between the bright lights of Hollywood and the darkness of his private life couldn't have been starker. The other cast members began to notice. Danny would sometimes show up on set withdrawn, quiet, almost unlike the boy audiences thought they knew. But then, as soon as the cameras rolled, he'd snap into character, firing off lines with perfect comedic timing. It was survival. Acting wasn't just his job, it was his armor. He learned early how to mask pain with humor, and for millions watching at home, that act worked flawlessly. One person who saw through the mask was Dave Madden, who played the group's bumbling manager, Reuben Kincaid. While on screen, Madden's character often clashed with Danny. Off-screen, the two formed an unlikely bond. Madden realized what the boy was going through and quietly stepped in. He gave Danny rides home, bought him meals, and, when things became unbearable, even let him sleep at his house. To a child desperate for safety, those gestures were life-saving. In many ways, Dave Madden became the closest thing Danny had to a real father figure during those years. But the scars ran deep. Even as Danny found moments of refuge, he carried a simmering anger that would later surface in self-destructive ways: drug use, run-ins with the law, and reckless behavior. Looking back, it's clear that the seeds of that chaos were planted during those early days on the Partridge Family. For all the laughs he gave America, he was quietly screaming for help behind the scenes. And Danny wasn't the only one masking turmoil. While his private battles stayed hidden from the cameras, another storm was brewing among the cast: this one involving a sudden disappearance that left fans stunned and the crew scrambling for answers. The truth about why Chris Partridge vanished after just one season would shock everyone. In the first season of the Partridge Family, young Chris Partridge sat behind the drums, smiling along as though he'd been born into the family band. Played by Jeremy Gelbwax, he seemed to fit right in. But when the second season rolled around, something strange happened. Chris was gone. No warning, no explanation. Just a new kid sitting at the drum kit. Fans were left scratching their heads. Who was this new face? And why had Jeremy disappeared so suddenly? The official line was vague. Creative differences. And the family moved away. But whispers behind the scenes painted a far different picture. According to those who worked on the set, Jeremy didn't mesh with anyone. Cast and crew described him as difficult, disruptive, and out of step with the show's chemistry. Even David Cassidy hinted in later interviews that Jeremy had personality conflicts with everybody. Imagine being part of television's most picture-perfect family, yet clashing so hard that producers quietly show you the door after only 1 year. Replacing him with Brian Forster was a gamble, but one that worked. Brian slid seamlessly into the role, and the show never addressed the switch. No farewell episode, no explanation for fans, just a quiet erasure. In an era before social media, the studio could bury the controversy with a smile and a wave. But for those on the inside, the shakeup was glaring proof that not everyone could survive the pressures of pretending to be a Partridge. Jeremy's departure became a cautionary tale. The Partridge image had to stay spotless, even if it meant rewriting reality. Behind the curtain, the show was less a family and more a machine, built to keep the illusion running no matter who got left behind. The kids weren't just playing instruments, they were playing roles in a production where every crack had to be hidden at all costs. And while Jeremy faded into obscurity, another cast member was harboring emotions that couldn't be swapped out or smoothed over. Susan Day was quietly falling for her on-screen brother, and what started as an innocent crush soon turned into one of the coldest rifts in the show's history. On the surface, Susan Day seemed like the perfect Laurie Partridge, beautiful, wholesome, and the picture of teenage innocence. But off-camera, her heart was tied in knots. As the seasons rolled on, Susan developed a deep crush on David Cassidy, her on-screen brother, and the undeniable star of the show. To the outside world, David was a teen idol with millions of adoring fans. To Susan, he was someone she saw every day, someone she thought might see her differently once the cameras stopped rolling. For a while, David did notice. The two grew closer, and whispers spread that there might be something more than friendship. But David, riding the tidal wave of fame, pulled away. He admitted years later that he didn't feel the same way and that he couldn't reciprocate Susan's feelings. What crushed Susan wasn't just rejection, it was how David handled it. In interviews, he later spoke about her crush publicly, something Susan had kept private for years. That betrayal stung deeply, and it marked the beginning of an icy distance that would never fully thaw. The fallout lingered long after the show ended. While most of the cast reunited for nostalgic specials, Susan refused to take part. Whether it was her heartbreak, resentment toward David, or simply a desire to move past the Partridge image, she consistently kept her distance. The rest of the cast noticed her absence, and fans began to speculate. Was it pride? Was it pain? Or was it something darker? An emotional scar from being exposed by someone she once trusted. What made the situation even more heartbreaking was how close Susan and David could have been. She once described their relationship as brother and sister with a spark, but that spark fizzled out, leaving only silence. Decades later, when David fell ill, Susan reached out with a heartfelt letter. But according to David's memoir, he never responded. The wall between them remained, built from unspoken words and old wounds. The show had already lost one Partridge to a quiet recast. Now it had lost another connection, this time to bitterness and regret. But the biggest fracture of all wasn't about love or friendship. It came from David himself, as he grew to resent the very show that made him a household name. And when his rebellion boiled over, It shocked fans who thought Keith Partridge was living the dream. At first, David Cassidy seemed to be living the ultimate fantasy. He was the golden boy of the Partridge Family, adored by millions, gracing magazine covers and selling out stadiums around the world. But the reality was far less glamorous. David felt trapped, suffocated by the bubblegum image forced on him. To his fans, he was the clean-cut Keith Partridge. To himself, he was a serious musician, desperate to be taken seriously. That tension built up year after year, until it finally exploded. In interviews, David admitted he despised the squeaky clean facade the network demanded. He wasn't Keith Partridge. He was a young man experimenting with drugs, pushing boundaries, and chasing the credibility of the rock stars he admired. He once shocked fans by appearing nearly naked on the cover of Rolling Stone, openly confessing to getting stoned while driving around New York City, even bragging about his wild exploits with women. For parents who thought their daughter's idol was wholesome, this revelation shattered the fantasy. For David, it was liberation. But rebellion came at a cost. His relationship with the show soured as he pushed further away from the Partridge brand. Behind the scenes, castmates noticed the growing tension. David bristled at being typecast, rolling his eyes at scripts that reduced him to a heartthrob punchline. He wanted to write raw, meaningful music, not lip-sync pop songs cooked up by producers. Every time he stepped onto that brightly lit set, it felt like another chain tightening around him. The pressure was immense. He wasn't just the star of a TV show, he was a global sensation carrying the weight of an entire franchise. The concerts, the records, the tours, it all fed the machine, but it drained David. He began to lash out, making decisions that shocked fans and rattled his family-friendly image. By the mid-1970s, the cracks in his public persona were impossible to ignore. Still, no one was prepared for the night when everything came crashing down. In London, during one of his sold-out concerts, the fever of David Cassidy mania turned deadly. Fans thought they were rushing toward joy. What happened instead left scars that would haunt David forever. By 1974, David Cassidy was at the height of his fame. His concerts weren't just shows, they were full-blown frenzies. Teenagers packed arenas, screaming until their voices gave out, desperate for even a glimpse of their idol. But in London that year, the hysteria reached a breaking point. Thousands of fans crammed into White City Stadium, and what was supposed to be a night of joy ended in horror. As Cassidy took the stage, the crowd surged forward. Barriers collapsed, bodies were crushed, and panic spread like wildfire. What fans didn't realize in the chaos was that one teenage girl, Bernadette Whelan, had been fatally injured in the stampede. She was just 14 years old. Others were left battered, bruised, and traumatized. For David, the tragedy was a wound that would never heal. He later confessed that he couldn't shake the guilt, admitting that he felt responsible even though it wasn't truly his fault. The press erupted. Headlines screamed about the dangers of Cassidy mania, questioning whether his shows were safe, whether the hysteria had gone too far. Parents who once adored him as a safe heartthrob now looked at him with suspicion, worried that his fame was spiraling into something uncontrollable. For David, the dream of being a star was permanently tainted. From that night forward, his career was shadowed by tragedy. Behind the scenes, the cast felt the ripple effects too. They weren't just colleagues, they were tied to the same image, the same machine that fueled David's rise. Some worried what the backlash would mean for their own futures, while others saw how broken David had become. The boy who had once seemed untouchable was suddenly human, fragile, haunted by a single night that defined his career more than any #1 hit. And yet, as the years passed, the story of the Partridge Family didn't end with the show going off the air. When the cameras shut down, old grudges and unresolved pain carried forward. And decades later, when the idea of a reunion surfaced, fans expected nostalgia. What they got instead revealed just how deep the wounds between cast members still ran. When the Partridge Family ended in 1974, fans hoped that one day the cast would reunite, bringing back the harmonies and smiles that had once defined primetime television. Over the years, reunions did happen, but never with the full family intact. And that absence spoke louder than any scripted line. Danny Bonaduce was often front and center, openly embracing the nostalgia. He leaned into the legacy, appearing in talk shows and retrospectives, even poking fun at his turbulent past. Shirley Jones also returned, reflecting fondly on the show's success, while Brian Forster and Suzanne Crowe occasionally joined in. But one name was almost always missing: Susan Dey. Her absence wasn't a scheduling conflict, it was a choice. After the show, Susan built a serious acting career, eventually starring in L.A. Law and earning critical acclaim. But she made it clear she didn't want to be tied to Laurie Partridge forever. More than that, her silent feud with David Cassidy, rooted in that unrequited crush, and his later public revelations about it, created a rift that never healed. When producers called for reunions, she refused. Her distance became one of the show's biggest mysteries, fueling endless speculation about what bitterness still lingered. David himself had mixed feelings. In his memoirs, he acknowledged the fractured relationships, even admitting he never answered the heartfelt letter Susan once sent him. The bond they could have had was lost in a sea of fame, resentment, and time. And when David's health declined before his death in 2017, the distance between him and Susan remained permanent. The legacy of the Partridge family is a strange one. On screen, they were a family who always found a way to sing together in harmony. Off-screen, they were fractured by personal battles, hidden tragedies, and wounds that time never truly healed. Fans may remember the music, the bright bus, and the smiles, but the real story behind the curtain was far more complicated. The show promised happiness, but for those who lived it, the memories were tangled in heartbreak, betrayal, and unanswered questions. And maybe that's the most haunting truth of all. The Partridge family was never really a family. It was a performance that cost its stars more than anyone ever realized. Even decades after the Partridge bus stopped rolling, the cast couldn't escape the shadow of the show, or the chaos it left behind. For Danny Bonaduce, the wisecracking redhead America once adored, adulthood was anything but smooth. He spiraled into drugs, arrests, and bizarre stunts that kept his name in headlines for all the wrong reasons. From being arrested for fighting to living out his struggles publicly on radio and reality TV, Danny seemed to carry the same bruises from childhood into his adult years. Yet somehow, in his own chaotic way, he embraced it. He turned himself into a shock jock celebrity, never hiding from the truth of what he'd endured. To fans, he was both tragic and unbreakable, a survivor forged in fire. But not every cast member lived long enough to rewrite their story. Suzanne Crowe, who played the youngest Partridge, Tracy, led a quieter life after the show. She stepped away from Hollywood entirely, marrying, raising children, and working in everyday jobs far from the spotlight. Then, in 2015, tragedy struck when Suzanne died suddenly of a rare heart condition at only 52. Fans were stunned. For the cast, it was another reminder that their family wasn't invincible. Shirley Jones, the matriarch on screen and in many ways off-screen too, expressed heartbreak at the loss of her TV daughter, calling it a shock to the whole family. Shirley herself carried her own complicated role in the saga. As David Cassidy's real-life stepmother, she straddled a blurred line between TV and reality. She later admitted that watching David burn out under the weight of fame was agonizing. She saw him chased by fans, buried in obligations, and ultimately haunted by addiction and personal demons. When David passed in 2017, the grief was heavy, but so was the silence from Susan Dey, who never reconnected with him before his death. That distance spoke volumes, and yet, even with the feuds, scandals, and tragedies, the Partridge family never truly faded. Reruns, DVD releases, and pop culture references kept the show alive for new generations. For some, it was nostalgia, a reminder of a simpler time. For others, it was a haunting symbol of how Hollywood polishes pain into perfection. The music was light, the laughter was bright, but behind it were stories of abuse, betrayal, heartbreak, and loss. The cast may have gone their separate ways, some scarred and some silent, but the truth lingers like a ghost. The happiest family on TV was one of the most fractured off-screen. And that contrast is what keeps the legend alive, because the real story of the Partridge Family was never just about getting happy. It was about how happiness was sold, and how the people inside that painted picture paid the price.